My presentation is about my forthcoming book. It's an academic project, but it began with my own personal experiences with psychedelics. Like many of you, I'm sure, I was finding that these experiences were incredibly profound and beneficial to my life in all sorts of ways. They were not only making me feel better, but they were helping me be more creative, more kind, more authentic. Just generally, everything was getting better. And at some point during one of my many trips, most of these were happening in Amsterdam, by the way, where it's completely legal. I had this thought pop into my mind. What is it about these experiences that's so beneficial? Like, what are these experiences? In other words, what is a psychedelic experience? What is going on when I'm in this state? When that thought popped into my mind, I was like, awesome, I've got a philosophical topic here. Because philosophers love to ask what is questions. We like to ask, what is justice? What is courage? What is love? And so on. So I found my what is question. Up until this point, I was working in analytic philosophy, specializing in the foundations of probability theory, judgment and decision making, that sort of thing. So my career suddenly took a hard left turn at probability and went into psychedelics. And then, as you could probably judge from the title, I also got interested in things like meditation and so on. Okay, so at some point when I was having these experiences, soon after that I had got my question, what is a psychedelic experience? And I realized that was a kind of juicy question. Even if I could just raise that question as a philosophical one, even if I couldn't answer it, that would still be an interesting project to go through. But at some point I had yet another experience, and that one gave me the answer to the question. Which at some point I realized it feels like what's special about these experiences is that I'm experiencing my mind. I'm engaging with my unconscious in some way. And then, of course, as soon as I had that thought, I was like, wait, isn't that what the word psychedelic means? And hasn't someone already said this before? And of course, that's the case. But at the time, I was using the word psychedelic the way that a lot of people use it now, which is a word to refer to a particular class of drugs or substances or medicines, whatever you want to call them. But substances like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, ayahuasca, and so on. In fact, if you go on Wikipedia right now and look at the entry for a psychedelic experience, you'll see that it's an experience you have when you consume a psychedelic. All right. So that doesn't really answer my philosophical question, what's so special about these experiences? What is this experience? And so we've kind of fallen into a weird convention where this term, which used to be meaningful, and we'll see the meaning in a moment, is now just functioning as a name for a class of substances. And people kind of argue over which substances fall into that category. Is MDMA a real psychedelic? Is it on the edge? There's been some debates about that. What about cannabis? Is cannabis a psychedelic? I've heard some people say that it's not a psychedelic if you smoke it, but it is if you eat it. All right, so that kind of shows you there's something funny going on here with the way we're using this word. So the word comes from Humphrey Osmond, and in some letters that he was exchanging with Aldous Huxley back in the 1950s, they were trying to find a name for these substances. At the time, the typical names that would be floating around with names like hallucinogen or psychotomimetic. Hallucinogen to indicate that the experiences you have with these substances is a hallucinatory one, and psychotomimetic to indicate that you're having a sort of psychotic-like experience with these substances. And both Huxley and Osmond thought these names they're just not getting at the essence of the experience. You don't always have hallucinations, and even when you do, that's not really what's super interesting about the experience. And then the experience can be psychosis-like sometimes, but not always, clearly. So they were looking for a better name to capture the essence of these experiences. And so they landed on psychedelic. And you see in this fragment of a letter from Osmond on 25th of March in 1956, he writes to Huxley, "It is absurd to label them as psychotomimetics. The name should have a clear meaning, be reasonably easy to spell and pronounce, and not be too like some other name." And they go through a bunch of other various options, and they land on psychedelics. Mind manifestors seems to be the most promising. Psychedelic seems unambiguous, not loaded with old associations, and clear. So it was being introduced at this time as like a new term, a technical term, to get away from the old associations that were made, that we had with these substances. And then, of course, we've had the 60s counterculture, and then the war on drugs, and then the Renaissance and psychedelics. And now we've got all sorts of associations with this name, psychedelic, which is kind of unfortunate because it was introduced to be a new, clean term. Okay, so in the book, I argue that we should go back to the original meaning because it puts a very useful perspective on this topic that we care so much about. I argue that we should be approaching psychedelics as using an experience-first approach, an experience-first understanding of psychedelics, where we work with this idea that psyche means mind or soul, if you prefer, and delos or delic meaning to reveal, to make clear or visible, or to manifest. So we put those together, we get mind revealing. And so to answer this question I have, a psychedelic experience is a mind revealing experience. Notice that that doesn't say anything about drugs, right? And same if we were to call these hallucinogens. You say, well, a hallucinatory experience is one in which you're having hallucinations. You can refer to these experiences without referring to the drugs. Okay, so we're at breaking convention, and I feel like we've kind of found a way into a sort of, let's say, a dumb or not entirely useful convention around this word. We're using landed on this convention of using the word psychedelic to refer to these substances, when really it's a way to refer to a particular class of experiences. So I want to propose that we break that convention and go back to the original one, which was useful. And I'm going to show you how it's more useful. Okay, so this is not a matter of words. What's at stake here is our concepts. We use words to pick out our concepts, but it's the concepts that's important. When we get our concepts right and like line them up, they're like lenses. We line them up, then things come into focus. We can see things more clearly than we would otherwise. So I want to demonstrate a few ways that sort of things become a bit clearer if we look at psychedelics and other things that we're interested in from this perspective of psychedelic meaning mind revealing. Okay. So let's go back to Osmond, because he was already onto this way back in 1957. He wrote in another letter to Huxley, I can't see any point in considering an experience of the other derived from epilepsy, schizophrenia, starvation, flagellation, vitamin deficiency, the reduced environment, dervish dancing, yogistic practices, more or less valuable than the ones derived from hashish, soma, peyote, ayahuasca, Wayson's new ones, psilocybin mushrooms. Or for that matter, mescaline, LSD 25. This list is really long, I've edited it down. It's all one to me. The whole point is whether the experience justifies the risk, discomfort, or time involved, and whether its fruits are good or evil. Okay, so instead of anchoring on these substances, expand our perspective and see that instead of thinking of psychedelic substances, think about psychedelic interventions. So there are many ways to have a psychedelic experience. What are some of the ways? Well, take a psychedelic. That's probably a good way to have a psychedelic experience. What's a psychedelic? As I mentioned before, people argue about that. Is MDMA a psychedelic? Is cannabis? I'm going to broaden that debate a little bit and argue that coffee can be psychedelic. I actually have a lot of friends who come up to me and say they're kind of embarrassed about it, that they don't drink coffee very often because it puts them into a psychedelic state. I've always been puzzled by this. I was like, how's that possible? But then one day I was reading through this book by Henri Poincaré where he was sort of analyzing the kind of creative process in mathematics. And there's this interesting section where he wrote, where he's reflecting on his creative process. One evening, contrary to my custom, I drank black coffee and could not sleep. Ideas rose in crowds. I felt them collide until pairs interlocked, so to speak, making a stable combination. It seems in such cases that one is present at his own unconscious work, made partially perceptible to the overexcited consciousness, yet without having changed its nature. Right? So if we look at what he's saying he's got access to his unconscious in a way that he wouldn't normally have due to coffee. So rather than thinking of, so I mentioned we should think of psychedelic interventions, but maybe think of psychedelics more like a function. What sorts of things can function as a psychedelic under what kinds of circumstances? For some people, certain circumstances, coffee can function as a psychedelic. Here's another way to have a psychedelic experience. Smell something. So I think pretty much everyone in this audience has probably had this experience. You're wandering around, minding your own business, going down the street or something like this, and you come across some smell. You walk past a bakery or someone's perfume, something like this, and it's a smell you haven't smelled since your early childhood. And for some reason, that smell triggers a memory from that childhood experience, right? And it comes rushing into your conscious experience. Perhaps the most famous example of this is Marcel Proust's description of eating tea-soaked madeleines in A Search for Lost Time. That's what that image refers to there. The reason why this happens is because our olfactory receptors have an unusually direct connection to the hippocampus. And so this cue for a memory can bypass the usual filters that we usually put on experience, and it can trigger this revelation of a memory. Okay, another example, another intervention would be to practice meditation. I'm going to talk about this one quite a bit. Here's an example of Steve Jobs talking about his meditation experience that really highlights how the meditative practice can be psychedelic in the sense of being mind-revealing. If you just sit and observe, by the way, I've highlighted all the bold bits that are the psychedelic bits. If you just sit and observe, you will see how restless your mind is. So that's not normally available to you. If you try to calm it, it only makes it worse, but over time it does calm. And when it does, there's room to hear more subtle things. So you can hear things you couldn't hear before. And that's when your intuition starts to blossom, so something new is coming out of you that wasn't there before. And you start to see things more clearly and to be in the present more. Your mind just slows down and you see a tremendous expanse in the moment. You see so much more than you could see before. Okay, so that's just a little example of how meditation can be mind-revealing. All right, there are many other examples. So we could practice yoga. We often associate with yoga the physical practice, like hatha yoga. There's much more to yoga than that, but the physical practice, I think, can be psychedelic. Here's another one, to create. If you have a truly creative experience, there's something in you that's coming out. And that sometimes it can be hard. We talk about like getting writer's block or a creative block. There's something trapped inside. You can feel it, you want to get it out, you can't. But when it does come out, it's a revelation. Okay, 6 examples. There are many, many more. You can imagine like this is a web page. You can scroll down and choose your option. There are different ways of having these experiences, and they have different qualities. And we can combine these interventions as well, right? So obviously you could meditate while taking a psychedelic. Okay. So at this point, I usually get the objection, doesn't this make all experiences psychedelic? Doesn't this trivialize the word? We had a good word, referred to these drugs that we really like, and you've ruined it. Now everything's psychedelic all the time. It's like the typical thing that a philosopher would do, is just ruin our words. I don't think that's right, but let's suppose that is the case, that for whatever reason, somehow it turns out that on this way of understanding things, which by the way is the original way, don't forget that. Yes, let's suppose all of our experiences are psychedelic. That isn't necessarily a problem, because I think the intuition behind this objection is that psychedelics are special. We want to be able to distinguish the experiences we have with the substances from all these other examples that I mentioned. And I think we can do that, even if we end up falling into the conclusion that all experiences are psychedelic. And there's 2 reasons why. The first is that we can, I'll explain in a moment, that psychedelic experiences come in degrees. And so the thought is that psychedelics create experiences that are very psychedelic, and that's why they're different from the other ones. Psychedelic experiences also come in kinds. So maybe what's special about psychedelics is that they create psychedelic experiences of a particular kind. All right, so let's go into those two reasons. Here's a little dimension, the degree to which an experience is psychedelic. So imagine we could rank experiences in terms of how psychedelic they are. So obviously we want to put the psychedelics way up here on the right. We could say that something like the example that I mentioned before of smelling something and getting that memory flashback, that's psychedelic, but nowhere near as psychedelic as having an experience of a psychedelic. We can have examples that are even less psychedelic than that, like very mundane experiences. I think we can recognize as psychedelic. So take the experience of trying to say a word, but it's stuck on the tip of your tongue. Right? You're in conversation, you really want to get this word out, but it's stuck. And it's only, for some reason, right? It's only when you finally relax and give up, move on, it's only then that the word actually pops into your mind. It's only when you've relaxed that top-down search procedure to find the word, once you relax that, from this bottom-up process, the word appears in your experience. So it's not like that word doesn't exist in your mind, right? You know the word. That's what's so frustrating about the experience. And all of a sudden it gets revealed. Okay, but it's just one word. That's just a tiny little bit of mind, right? That's less than smelling something, and much less, obviously, than the kinds of explosive memories or other kinds of experiences that we have with psychedelics. We could argue about the orderings and the relative distances, but I think we can make sense of something like this. And of course, like imagine, you take psychedelics with different doses or different kinds of psychedelics. We can recognize that they have different degrees of effect on the mind. So we could put meditation somewhere in the middle. Okay. So one reason why psychedelics are special is because they're so revealing of the mind, right? Way more than the other ones. But also there's something I think quite interesting about psychedelics is that the experiences we have with them, they're often surprising. The content that comes to the surface is highly novel. It's somehow like deeply buried. We're often surprised that, well, how did I remember this? I had no idea this was there, or how's my mind capable of this? Or, well, these emotions, I didn't know they were there, but I recognize that they were there. I think this is because psychedelics are really good at bringing up highly novel content. But in the process, they can distort that content. It's not necessarily a true image of what's in the mind. Think of it as like an X-ray machine. It gives you an image of what's inside the body, but not exactly what's in the body. And the X-ray machine could be distorting what's in there. Or another analogy that I like is imagine opening up a can of soda. You reveal the soda inside, but in the process, you release the carbon dioxide. I forget which one now. It becomes effervescent. So you change the nature of the cola. So psychedelics are doing that to the mind. They reveal the mind, but they're also changing it to some degree in the process. So if we imagine we're going to break down that one dimension of the degree to which an experience is psychedelic into two subdimensions, it'd be good if we could move that. But, okay. Right there now, this says novelty, how novel an experience is. And over here, you can see that one, clarity, how clear an experience is. So, thank you. So when we take a psychedelic, we can have a very highly novel experience, but it may be lacking in clarity. When we meditate, we may, like the typical meditation session for a regular person, it's not going to have anywhere near the kind of novelty of the psychedelic experience, but it'll have much more clarity, on average. There are obviously exceptions. And we could recognize that like taking a psychedelic is still more psychedelic than practicing meditation because it's further away from this origin. Like this origin point is your normal state of consciousness. So we can see these two interventions that are just different in the degree, they're also different in the kind of psychedelic experience that they can induce. We can then also start wondering, okay, what happens if you could somehow start bringing more novelty to your meditation practice? And what happens if you could start bringing more clarity to your psychedelic trips? You start getting the best of the both worlds. And now you may do this by, say, for example, combining these two interventions. meditating regularly before your trips, maybe even meditating during your trips, maybe using your trips to help you understand what's going on in your meditation practice. These two things can feed into each other. As you do that, you start moving even further away from the origin. You start having experiences that are even more psychedelic. Note that you're not necessarily increasing the dose of the psychedelic that you're taking. You're doing a different kind of psychedelic intervention. So what do you get up there as you increase all of this? You have to read the book to find out. But it's ineffable, so that's one reason why I can't say it right now. Okay, let's flip things around a little bit. So I've been talking about psychedelic experience. Sometimes it's, in fact, often I think, when we have an important concept, it's useful to think about its opposite. What's the opposite of a psychedelic experience if a psychedelic experience is a mind-revealing experience? It would be a mind-concealing experience. So let's call that a psychocryptic experience. Cryptic comes from the Greek term kryptos, from cryptography to conceal. So psychocryptic experience is the opposite of a psychedelic experience. Let's distinguish that from a psychocryptic state. Experience is a sort of the change, the process, and the state is the thing that you're in right now. So if you can have a psychedelic experience right now, that must mean that you're in a psychocryptic state right now. To some degree, your mind is concealed from you right now. Okay. The difference between the two is a little bit like a ship being in the fog. You can't see the ship. And then a ship sailing into the fog. It's being concealed. Right? And when the ship comes back, it's being revealed. All right. So we could put all these concepts together and start answering some interesting questions that we have. We've already kind of I've already gestured to some of these already. So for example, why do psychedelics and meditation induce mystical experiences? Well, they're kind of like different ways of getting up into that corner of psychedelic space. Why do they have synergistic effects? Well, they're both psychedelic interventions, right? And so they're both working on this sort of psychedelic process that can happen on the mind. Okay, here's a puzzle. Why do psychedelics facilitate increases in mindfulness? There's lots and lots of studies now showing this. We've seen that result many times, so I think a lot of us are familiar with it, but on the face of it, it's quite puzzling. Psychedelics look nothing like meditation. Why would you get mindfulness out of a psychedelic trip? I don't have time to go through the full answer here, so I'm just going to put this, offer this proposition to you, that mindfulness is the opposite of a psychocryptic state. The more mindful you are, the less psychocryptic your current mental state is. The more access you have to your mind, the more aware you are, the more flexible your mental state is. So to get mindfulness, you have to move away from your current psychocryptic state. So if you go from point A, your current psychocryptic state, to point B, more mindfulness, you've got to move away from that state. That journey is a transformation. And as you go through that journey, you have an experience, and that's a psychedelic experience, a revelation of the mind. So that's why these things hang together so nicely. Okay. Final slide. One last thought about all this. So various authors have considered the sort of psychedelic roots of philosophy. Right, so lots of people have argued that, so the ancient Greeks were drinking kykeon, which is like an LSD-like substance, or an ayahuasca analog. There's a lot of excitement about this idea that the origin, especially of our Western culture, originates with psychedelics. But this psychedelic history of philosophy looks different when we understand that psychedelic is mind-revealing. It's not necessarily about drugs, right? When we ask, is philosophy psychedelic, does it have its origins in psychedelic experiences? We're asking, well, we can ask it, does it have its origins in mind revelation? So it's a different way of looking for a different kind of evidence set that we might be looking for. Instead of archaeological traces for LSD and pots or whatever, we should maybe go read Plato and see, was he talking about anything that looked psychedelic? And indeed, he did a lot. So when we look at Plato, we see lots of references and uses of psychedelic techniques and psychedelic experiences. So anamnesis is the theory that when you're learning through the philosophical process, it's not new facts being transferred to you. It's something, knowledge inside you that you've forgotten and you're remembering. Or take acrasia. This is a big puzzle for the ancient Greek philosophers. Why do we do things that are bad for us when we know that they're bad for us? Right? This is a kind of forgetfulness. We fall into these psychocryptic states. That's acrasia. The Socrates' method of Elancus is this questioning or probing. He describes it, his process as a midwifery for philosophy. It's a process of giving birth to ideas or principles that are in his students. He didn't like to refer to them as students, but basically that's what they were. Or aporia is this state of profound uncertainty and wonderment, this kind of openness to looking at things afresh. And eros, the power of beauty or love in the right kind of way to draw the mind to some philosophical truth. This way of activating the mind and moving it forwards. There's so much in Plato here. The constant use of mythology as well as another psychedelic technique. Clear parallels to tantric practices, for example. So, philosophy is psychedelic, right? It's not like we're looking for the psychedelic origins of philosophy. If you think about what philosophy is, this love for wisdom and using these techniques and experiences to become more wise, it just is another philosophical, psychedelic intervention, just like meditation, just like consuming a psychedelic. And it's why so many mystical wisdom traditions have had a distinction between wisdom and knowledge. They have philosophy, they have a philosophical system as part of the package, right? And they make a distinction between wisdom and knowledge, or lower and upper knowledge. The lower knowledge is the sort of the stuff you can learn through words, the kind of thing I'm sharing with you now. But then you put that into practice to have these experiential states where you're acquiring an ineffable form of wisdom. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.